Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to Wilbercross High School and its tiny auditorium. I've only been here once, and it was for the school musical. Because my colleague Melissa, her daughter was the star, and it was fabulous, and the place was packed with parents and grandparents and neighbors and everything. Anyway, we're here to discuss the education wars with the great historian and the great journalist who wrote it. But first we're going to have a welcome from Leslie Bateau, who is the head of the Federation of Teachers in New Haven.
Thank you, Professor Blight. Thank you to Johann and Jennifer for being here. It really is highlight of the week for me to be in the audience with all of you and listen to this conversation. I guess I just want to highlight one thing. I haven't read the whole book yet, but I've read some of it. And I was lucky enough to spend some time with aspiring teachers in the education pathway here at Wilbercross to discuss some of the book. And what we were lingering on first and foremost is the definition of public school. So I just want to thank you for giving us the tool that we need, when we go to the legislature every year and fight for what we believe we need, which is fully funded schools. We have tools now from you. It's a manual. In fact, one young man sitting in the back of the class was like, "Manual, when you can do something yourself," he said. And I said, exactly, yes. We're going to use this DIY. We're going to use this so that we have the tools to do what we know we need to do, which is protect public schools, taxpayer funded, democratically controlled, universally accessible. So that's public school. Thank you for that definition. And I'm just so looking forward to this conversation this evening. So thanks again.
You'd think she was a union organizer or something. Did you catch that? Thank you, Leslie. Again, welcome. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition over at Yale. I wanted to do this panel ever since I met Jennifer, which is, a few years ago now, when she was a fellow here, or you taught here in education studies. And to my left, Johann Neem was here before at a conference we did, is it 3 years ago or 4, my colleagues? The conference we did called Trust the Teachers, which was all about the crisis in teaching, the crisis in public schools, the idea of what teachers are. And we invited Johann because he's such a good historian of education. I want to thank the other people who co-sponsored this and helped us plan this. The good folks here at Wilbercross. It's Principal Matt Brown. Matt, are you wherever you are? Oh, there you are in the back. Does the principal always have to guard the door? Is that, yeah, okay. Melody Troxler, who's the IT specialist here, set all this up for us. And Sal DeLucia, who is probably a rock star here because he's the head of the theater program and the manager of this auditorium. Thank you, Sal, wherever you are. And we also had other co-sponsors, especially the Education Studies program at Yale, the Federation of Teachers here in New Haven, and the Southern Connecticut State History Department. Whoa, all right, a history department, imagine that. Okay, now, this is going to be a freewheeling, honest-to-God, sometimes shoot-from-the-hip conversation with my two colleagues, and then eventually we have a handheld mic, or we have a mic right up front, we can march it around eventually, I'm sure, for Q&A from all of you. I just want to say a couple things at the outset as well about the books. The books are from Possible Futures. Yeah. Local bookstore, the owner is here selling books, both Jennifer's and Johann's book. And This is on Edgewood Avenue here in New Haven, a quite new independent bookstore. If you don't know about it yet, go there tomorrow or the weekend, whatever, as soon as you can. Go to Possible Futures. Cool postcards down there, bookmarks, and even cooler books. I spent the first 7 years of my career as a public high school teacher in a school much like this. It was big. We had almost 3,000 students. This was in Flint, Michigan in the 1970s. For a few of you, that's way back in a previous century. It's still probably the most important teaching I've ever done. Sorry for my own students who are here, but it probably is the most important teaching I ever did. It was a volatile decade, to say the least, the 1970s. We were trying to digest the crisis of busing, the crisis of magnet schools, all the leftover issues of the 1960s, all kinds of turmoil with curriculum. And I was among a group of, I suppose you'd call them young Turk teachers of history. We thought we were hot. We thought we knew things. We were 60s folks, and we did a lot to screw up the curriculum, frankly, because we were specializing in this and specializing in that. And, actually, we were doing some good teaching because we got a lot of people excited about history, but we really did mess up the curriculum. That's another story. But I also witnessed what is so evident in this book. In American cities and in rural communities of all kinds, everything in our society, whether it's joyous and to be celebrated or whether it's distressing and a terrible problem, all flow into the public schools. Every problem Flint, Michigan had came into our schools. And it was still a relatively prosperous time in Flint, Michigan. If you've been paying any attention in recent years, it's no longer a prosperous time in Flint, Michigan. The city is in deep trouble. The high school I taught at was brand new the year I entered it in 1971. It's now closed. 3 of the 4 public high schools in that city are now closed. Now that's unique to that particular city. But as this book also shows, as soon as enrollments go down in public school systems, the first people endangered, of course, are the personnel, the teachers. And pretty soon, they're gone. I left before I got pink-slipped. Pink-slipped used to be a verb. For those of you who don't know, that meant you're noticed that you were being, eventually at least, fired. We had all kinds of culture wars, but we didn't call it that then. We had all kinds of history wars. We didn't call it that then. We all had other kinds of names for it. The wars over magnet schools. The wars over community control. The wars over parents, although we didn't always call it parents' rights. It was just parents. We were thrilled when parents would come to school and care about something. It was hard to get them to come. Now, some have different attitudes. We'll come back to culture wars. We'll come back to all of this in a moment. Let me introduce my 2 guests, and we're thrilled to have them here. Johann has come from a long way away, Western Washington. Johann Neem is one of the best historians we have of American education, and particularly of the history of public schools. He did his BA, I think, at Brown, PhD at the University of Virginia. He's written 3 books, written or edited 3 books that I know of. Creating a Nation of Joiners, which is about the origin and development of civic culture in late colonial revolutionary early republic Massachusetts. And then his book, Democracy Schools, which is for sale right down here, and there's still plenty of left. They're not moving fast enough. Come on. Democracy Schools, The Rise of Public Education in America. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. What is this thing called a public school, and where does it come from? And then the book called What is the Point of College? Seeking Purpose in an Age of Reform. And then finally, actually, a fourth book, which I think you co-edited with my colleague, Johann Freeman, right? Called Jeffersonians in Power. It's a big collection of essays about that fascinating problem of when the Jeffersonians, with all their ideals, got into power and suddenly faced all the practicalities of governing. Not a new thing. Johann, thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming. I'll also say, too, when they made me, for my sins, be president of the Organization of American Historians, one of your 1,000 jobs when you do that is you have to plan a program for the annual convention, and you have to appoint a program committee, and you have to have co-chairs. Johann is one of the first two people I went to co-chair the program for the OAH because I respect him so much. I know he knows so much about early America, and I also know that he's a great citizen of our profession and cares about these matters. And I should add, too, we launched an initiative in the OAH this year, which is not brand new, but we're trying to do it beyond what anyone else has done before. We're going to bring upwards of 100 high school teachers of American history at our expense. We raised a lot of money for this to our annual convention that's in Chicago. And Johann has been deeply involved in helping plan sessions around the teachers. We're going to treat teachers like the intellectuals they want to be treated as and the professionals they want to be treated as at our professional association. And Johann has helped me put all that together. Now, Jennifer Berkshire, whose book we're here to celebrate and discuss and criticize if you wish, why not, is a freelance journalist. She writes very frequently for The Nation magazine, among other outlets and sources. She runs a podcast called Have You Heard? You should hear it. Some of her most recent essays, if you look up her name with The Nation, you'll see she writes there virtually every month. She's written pieces on Moms for Liberty. She's written things on parental rights. She's written pieces on PragerU. You all know what PragerU is? Weird, yeah. Ugh, their thing on Douglas is, ugh. Anyway. And her most recent piece, I think it's September 3rd, is entitled "Democrats are Finally Running a Teacher. What Took Them So Long?" That's kind of a cool title. Anyway, this whole moral panic of the history of the teaching wars we're having right now, or the school wars, is her beat. And nobody does it quite like she does. She's the author of an earlier book with her co-author, I should say, Jack Schneider, entitled "The Wolf by the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education," a big theme in this book as well. I said earlier she taught here in Ed Studies. She also teaches in the Boston College Prison Education Project, and she's co-author of The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. The title implies, does it not, that this book is written with a certain advocacy on an issue that needs it. And before I start throwing questions both to my left and right, Mira Debs just arrived too, who is the Director of Education Studies here at Yale and one of our sponsors for this. Thank you, Mira, indeed, for coming. Okay. Johann. And then, Jennifer, you follow up, and then we'll get after it. What is this thing called a public school? What are its origins? Who conceived this idea? This idea that somehow taxes ought to support public education. audacious idea that came out of somehow that fledgling democracy of the early republic. I know that's not easy to explain in a few minutes of an answer, but where does this come from in American culture?
Yeah, thank you. Am I on?
There's a little button on your mics if you... I can pass this back and forth, and I just got over COVID. It's gone, so...
I think this is not picking me up.
It's not picking you up? You're not hearing his mic? Oh, here comes the talent.
Well, while we're working on that, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for all those who helped make this possible. I'm going to do a very short, quick version of where public schools came from. I think one of the things that is really important to remember, there are kind of two pieces. One is the piece that all of the people coming out of the revolution understood that republics are really fragile kinds of polities. And so one of the impetus of public schools was a recognition that the quality of our society is really going to depend on the quality of our citizenry. And so how do you cultivate a citizenry that's empowered to take care of the public goods and cares about it, but also has the critical capacities to engage with it? But the real trick, and I think this is really important, is we can look down and read Jefferson and all kinds of, important dead guys and women as well who wrote about public education and said all these things, but that's not why public schools became public. One of the things that I think is really important is they became public because parents and students and families and communities saw them as benefits to their lives, and not just economically, just culturally and socially. And so you've developed this institution in a society that has very few public institutions where people really felt invested in the welfare of the institution, and through that institution, their communities. And so one of the keys that turned public schools, made public education truly possible, was that local schools had so many stakeholders, and those stakeholders really cared about them, and they cared about them because their kids went to them or their grandkids went to them, but they also means that they cared about the other people in those schools, and that was essential to being a public school. And this really matters because at the Revolution, education was not a public good. People paid for their own education if they had the money. Churches kind of provided some education. Most people didn't get educated. And when people started to say, hey, let's provide taxes for public schools, one of the defining features of a public school, according to Jennifer, a lot of people said, no, why should I take care of someone else's kid? And taxpayers actually had, they're still saying that, but they had stones thrown at them. They had, taxpayers were never, I guess, very popular, but when they would go around, they would actually face sometimes violent resistance to collect school taxes. And this was the idea that I don't need to be responsible for some other person's education. And one of the things public schools did as they emerged is they convinced so many people that it's worthwhile, that we all benefit when we pool our resources together, because my child is better off, but so are all of our children, and so is our community. And so one of the things that I took out of that history lesson is when we stop all being common stakeholders in common institutions, we could go backwards, because it took a lot of work to turn education from a private good into something that's public and that we can all care for, and therefore care for other people's children, not just our own.
Wow, that's not easy to do so fast. Jennifer, one of the many overall arguments of your book is that this problem is nothing new. And yet, you say this time it is different. Pick up this question about, wait, this is going to get tricky here. You're going to see more of my socks than you really need to. Anyway, pick up this question of the history of this thing called a public school, this amazing democratic experiment, where it comes from and why we're always fighting about it.
So my co-author and podcast co-host is an education historian, and so I always feel like by association, I get to play the part of an education historian, but then, I didn't really think it through because here I am with these two. But what I can tell you is that one of the really great ironies about our present moment is that you have folks like, for example, former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, putting forward what they're selling as a really forward-thinking vision, a vision of innovation. And the bumper sticker for that would be, fund students, not systems. And the irony is that it looks a lot like the history that Johann was just telling us about. If you've heard about Project 2025, think of this as Project 1825. And the idea that instead of taxing ourselves and offering a free K through 12 education for every kid, instead we're going to shift the burden of paying for it back onto individual parents. And the reason we moved away from that hundreds of years ago was because it didn't work, right? That it wasn't. It was the world was unfathomably unequal if your education depended upon the size of the bank account that your parents had, and then all the other kids went to what were known as pauper schools that were run by churches or charities. And so when I read the descriptions of what's on offer in a lot of places right now, to me, I can't help but chuckle in a really dry, bitter way. And so you were asking about what is different now? Well, we've seen these flare-ups of the education wars decade after decade. Anytime we're at odds about what schools should do and what kids should learn, that's when things get heated. So in the 70s, when you were in Flint, people were battling because they didn't want their kids learning about feminism and multiculturalism and secular humanism. Anytime there's a push to expand civil rights, it runs right through the schools, as you were saying, and that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. So here we are today, and we have kids, for example, saying, expand civil rights. We want the broadest possible horizon. We want a world that is freer and more equal for all of us. And you have other folks who are saying, this is all happening way too fast. Slow the cart down. What's really different this time is that in the past, when we would see these kinds of battles emerge, you didn't feel as though the entire project of public education was hanging in the balance. And that's what's happening today, that we're not just arguing about what schools should teach, how they should be run, and who they should be for. We're arguing about whether they should continue to exist, period. That was kind of a downer.
That's all right. We run a Center for the Study of Slavery. We're not unaccustomed to doing downers, but we usually bring them back somewhat. Both of you talk a little bit more about where this incredible thing, this public school, fits in the history of democracy, this idea of democracy. I mean, where else in the world has this been attempted? I mean, actually, in the 20th century, other countries, in some ways, got better at it, at our model, but they got better at it. A public-funded, universal right to an education. Talk about this in terms of, talk about it any way you want, but in terms of this idea of a democratic experiment. I've often just maintained that the most democratic thing the United States has ever created is the public school. And maybe it's one of the reasons we take it for granted so much. We just think of course it should exist. Democracy, public schools. How do they, you need the mic, that's right. I gotta keep passing this back.
Okay. Democracy, public schools in a minute. I think David's right. Like, I think we forget how amazing this idea is that we can provide every person and want to provide every person a quality education. And this is one of the things Jennifer writes about in the book, is this is a profoundly amazing thing. And I think, again, there's two ways to approach it. One is you can't have a democracy without educated citizens. And so it's literally an essential institution to our collective well-being. But there's another side to it that I think you're getting at, which is there's a spirit to the idea that as a people, we collectively govern ourselves, and that these schools as local institutions where we socialize and raise the next generation are profoundly democratic in a kind of political sense as well. And there's a third piece, which I think is really profoundly important, but we lose sometimes, which is what we did is we started in the 19th century to a much more expansive group than had ever had access before, but limited in terms of race and limited regionally. The North was ahead of the South, but we expanded access to the basic subjects of the liberal arts. And we did that because there were people who believed that the capacity to have a rich interpretation of the world, what Jefferson called the pursuits of happiness, belonged to everyone. And so everyone should understand and be able to see the world through history. Everyone should understand and be able to see the world through what they call natural history, we call the sciences. That these things are actually so enriching that they're fundamental to the pursuit of happiness. And so that a democracy not just is a society that depends on its citizens or that has collectively run schools, but that a democracy owes every citizen access to the kind of richness of a broad education to fulfill its own mission, its promise to each person. And it's amazing when you think about the ways our policymakers talk about education, and it's so boring, and then you read these 19th century people who should be boring, and they're talking about the imagination, and they're talking about access to the liberal arts, and they're talking about expanding the capacity of people to just grapple with the world, and that making that rich experience of a world, what they call self-culture, what we might call self-improvement, a democratic right. And I think to me, that is the most inspiring part of the story, is that every child deserves that ability to form themselves and grow. And we never did it perfectly. We still have not done it perfectly. But the fact that that aspiration exists is amazing to me.
50 million students. Took this right out of your book, Jennifer. 100,000 schools. Slightly more than 3 million teachers. And probably slightly more than a $1 trillion business. That's public schools. Just think of the numbers. What is the current operative number of the number of people in any kind of school? Is it 85, 90% is in a public school? Yeah, 85 to 90% of all people who get up every day and go to some school, including universities, colleges, it's a public school. All my education is in public schools. I'm not casting any stones against private play. I teach at a pretty good private one here now, and I'm not bitching. I like it there. We do some good things like education studies. Anyway, but without public schools, there are just millions and millions of us who wouldn't have any education. We just wouldn't. All right, Jennifer, let's dig down into some of this. You have a great section, well, several sections in the book. It's kind of, I forget what you exactly called it. It's like nothing new under the sun, in a sense. Like book banning's not new. Struggles over religious issues, hardly new. Struggles over sexuality and gender, hardly new. Power, education, schools. I mean, it's about somehow power at the end of the day. Parental rights, that's not brand new either. But our schools now and our school boards and our public conversation about it is roiling over this. Why now? Which is kind of a political question, so go wherever you want with it.
Well, I think the short, easy answer is we're fighting about schools now because we're fighting about everything, and that schools are among the only institutions that bring together people regardless of their politics, and that's just a lot harder right now. But I thought, as Johann, as you were describing that earlier vision, you know, like, I wanted to kind of get up and cheer because it is really inspiring, and we've gotten so far away from it. And I think in many ways, what we're seeing now is an effort to really roll back that idea that everyone is entitled to this kind of an education that would broaden their horizons and enable them to demand more. And so when I started researching the parents' rights movement, I was amazed to find that the first real parents' rights crusade emerged in the 1920s. And Cam from my Politics of Public Education class is here, and he may remember me talking about this. But there was an effort at the time to put a ban on child labor in the U.S. Constitution. And this really emerged as an intense political fight because there were a lot of people who didn't like this idea at all. There were a lot of parents who worried that this was just going to open the door to having basically what they considered almost federal spies poking around, seeing if, like when David was supposed to be at school, was he really working on the family alfalfa farm? And so there was a lot of resistance to this, but there was also...
alfalfa was in Flint.
There was also a lot of resistance from powerful conservative industry leaders. And on the one hand, they liked the idea of having these little laborers, nimble, able to fit into the nooks and crannies of the factory and the mine, less likely to form unions and demand more money. But the real reason was that when they looked out at the world, they believed that inequality was our natural state, and that requiring everyone to go to school and get an education was mucking up the natural order of things. And I think that today, if you really listen to some of the arguments that are being made, not just the kind of red-hot rhetoric about, whatever book people want to ban or gender ideology, et cetera, or whatever the latest outrageous thing Trump said on the campaign trail, if you actually listen to the big argument that's being made, you hear beneath it the case that our effort to make the country more equal has gone too far. We need to roll it back. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's what we count on public education to do. So it's not at all surprising that they're at the center of this, but I think it makes it even more important to go back and learn a little bit about the history of it and realize how big and democratic that original vision was, how we've gotten away from it, and why we need to get back there.
Jennifer, stay with that a moment, because there's a lot of analysis in your book about, well, first of all, about the ideal of the right to an equal education. But education isn't equal in America, not even close. And we have gross inequalities, even between and among public schools, depending on communities, and wealthy communities, not wealthy communities. Talk about that a bit. And I want you to drill down a little more, if you don't mind, because it's really the big thread of your book, is this crusade to erode, if not destroy, public schools. Where's that coming from? Who's funding it? So that's really two questions, but take them in any order you'd like.
It's so easy to despair over the state of public education and the fact that it has fallen so short of its promise. But I do think it's important to kind of back up and look at that trend over decades and decades. And what you see is that in fits and starts, you see the pool of students who go to school getting broader and broader, first by race, and then in the 1970s, we guarantee kids with disabilities the right to an education. And prior to that, if you happen to have a child with a disability, you were completely on your own. The school did not have to accept the child, and that meant if you were wealthy, you could pay for tutoring or a special program, but if you weren't, the kid was just on their own. No, basically, its future was confined to your family. And so it's really important to think of that kind of broad sweep. Now, one of my favorite lines in the book, the last third of the book is basically, we go around and we visit these various communities where people are doing a particularly good job defending their public schools. And there's a line from an organizer in North Carolina, and she says, defending public schools is not the same as defending the status quo. And to me, one of the really exciting and encouraging things that's happening right now, because the situation in a lot of places is so dire, you're starting to see the coalition of people who are waking up and realizing, wow, we could lose this thing. When I got involved in education advocacy about a decade ago, the folks you would meet were always the ones who had been the best served by their local public schools. They were affluent suburban moms, and they were fighting really hard to keep that same level of resources. They wanted those AP class and that 5-star theater program. But now what you're seeing is that those parents are starting to ally themselves with folks for whom the schools have never delivered. And that might be in a place like North Carolina. Those are rural schools that have been underfunded for generations. Those are schools attended primarily by African American and Latino kids.
They don't have a theater program.
They don't have a theater program. And so that kind of coalition that starts from the basic premise that this is an idea that we can't afford to let go, but it has never been what we need it to be. To me, that feels like a really exciting place to start.
Yeah, well, both of you can weigh in on this business of the current crusade, not an unfair term, against public schools. And that's not new either, is it? I mean, the public school has always been controversial. At the same time, it has developed this great love and great following. Most people, I mean, if you poll people, they love their public school, or they're worried about it, and they care about it, and they want to do something about it. David Pepper makes this case. He's an author in Ohio who's written a lot about. He's fantastic. He's been writing about how, well, he's been basically saying, why doesn't his party, the Democratic Party, make the public school the center of everything? Because that's at least something that people like. But this idea of whatever you want to call it, right-wing or conservative or unegalitarian attacks on the public school, that's not brand new either, is it? Oh, sorry. Keep waiting for them to respond and realize.
Yeah. So I guess there's two pieces that I kind of want to pick up on. And one is when, and they relate. They relate to your question. One is when Jennifer was talking about this idea that for so many people, education's become a private good, right? And the stakes are so high in our economy that parents will do whatever they can to get their kids to the right public school or the right private school and to get them to the right college and leave anybody behind on the way. And there's a vision of individualism in that is that the self-made, I'll say person, it used to be the self-made man of the 19th century, the self-made man makes themselves out of nothing, pulls himself up by their own bootstraps. The public school comes out of another ideal of individualism, which is that we all thrive as individuals only when the collective is strong, and that we all are better off when our collective institutions are better off. And what's interesting about the love Americans have for their public schools that enables bipartisan coalitions to come together locally that Jennifer's written about to protect public schools from privatizers is that that's actually shared on both sides of the political aisle. There is a commitment that both Republicans and Democratic parents recognize, which is that if our shared institutions that nurture our kids falter, we all lose. And so these two types of individualism are in competition. And I think what's happening now is, as Jennifer pointed out, the people who really want to privatize and have money behind privatization can take advantage of the fact that we're so divided. And what I want to say is, like, this is where maybe I sound a bit more conservative, right, is that the culture wars are real, because the other piece of a public school that public schools have always struggled with is that they're socializing institutions. They're places where diverse people, and I went to public schools, I was born in India. This is both their greatest asset and something that we struggle over, is that they're places where people become Americans. And that capacity to take diverse people and forge a common kind of Americanness out of people is actually one of the wonderful things they do. And when we don't agree on that process of what it means to be an American and how to become one, then we start then the kind of cultural resources that we need underlying our society to enable us to engage in political conflict without hating each other are faltering. And I think we're at this moment, and I don't think they're all false. I think there's a lot of money funding right-wing kind of anger, but I think there's also examples that people are pulling where they can say, look, are public schools going too far? Are they becoming partisan? Are they embracing ideas that are so far out of the mainstream? And most aren't. But there's enough examples that parents start to wonder, because we're in this time where we're so culturally divided. And so we have two battles to fight. One is this idea that publicly, that both parties, parents share, which is we're all in this together, and that we're going to be stronger, and our kids are going to be better off if our collective institutions allow people to flourish. Like, that's a kind of individualism that says individuals flourish when the community is healthy and the public institutions are healthy, and that can be widely shared across the political aisle. It's harder to do when so many of us distrust the people on the other side because we think they're not real Americans. And this comes from the progressive as well as the right wing. We think they're not people we would want to associate with. And when we start to stereotype them that way, most of people are not actually like that. Like, there's also studies that show most Democrats think Republicans are like X, and most Republicans are not like that, and most Republicans think Democrats are like Y, and most Democrats actually don't believe those things. So it's about the stereotypes we've developed through the media and other forces that make us so distrustful of each other. It makes us harder to remember what we do share, which is a commitment to our kids.
I always love it when Johann apologizes because he might say something conservative. Now, come on, man. I mean, you prevent us from being an echo chamber, and what you said isn't necessarily conservative, to be frank. You both make the point. He does it in the sidebar you use from his own work, and then you pick up on it and go with it. That this problem, and a lot of us reading it may not like this, but you both make the claim that this problem cannot be solved ultimately in a partisan way. If we make the schools the center of our fights, and we got big fights now, big fights, we could lose the schools altogether. I mean, pick up on that if you would, because this is, you know, if I met Betsy DeVos, I'd have a hard time finding a conversation with her, I think. Well, I could talk about Grand Rapids. She's from Grand Rapids. But her ideas about vouchers and school choice is so antithetical to the public school. And yet, we can't solve it by partisanship.
So,
What you got from him?
yes, definitely. My co-author and I have both really been influenced by Johann, and I would say that me in particular, you know, I love to get out there and mix it up, right? Like to.
She's just come from a tour of Iowa where she gave
I
7 talks.
did. I've been barnstorming through Iowa, and but I found Johann's argument really convincing that we can't. There really isn't any way to win the culture war, and to the extent that we've gotten hate mail about the book, it's from people who really do not like that argument, right? That they're ready to win. And some of you may be familiar with the group Braver Angels. So Braver Angels was started in 2016 after the election. They were, they were trying to figure out how, for voters in Ohio, it was morning in America, and for voters in parts of New York, they were in the pits of despair. So they had an idea to get together a small group of voters representing both of these sides and to just get them talking. And over time, more and more of their work has come to focus on education. And so I've had the opportunity to interview the founder a couple times, and he would describe these events where basically they would get someone to volunteer to open up their home. They would have conservative parents invite some of their friends, liberal parents invite some of their friends, and many ground rules. Ground rule number 1, you can't spend the whole time relitigating the past, like who said what, right? And instead the focus is really on trying to get people to articulate a vision of the future. And what they would discover that was, 9 times out of 10, people had really surprisingly similar visions of what they wanted for their own kids. Everybody wanted their kids to grow up to be critical thinkers. They wanted schools that offered all kinds of resources, and that that became a way of lowering the temperature. And the other thing that people really agreed upon was that they were uncomfortable with the way that people they knew were fighting about this stuff on social media, right? And so that then that becomes kind of the center of it. And I'll just share one more story because I thought this one was pretty remarkable. There was a big story over the summer in ProPublica about a woman who ran for school board in Texas. And she ran, this is a rural community now trending kind of exurban. And she ran as a Republican, first time that had ever happened, right? These had always been nonpartisan races. She's very active in conservative media, and she runs on a pledge to root out indoctrination in the local schools. She is going to find it. And so she gets there and she takes her job very, very seriously. And she starts going through all the curriculum and pretty quickly realizes that what she thought she was going to find wasn't there. And so she goes back to her allies, the folks that helped get her elected, and she shares with them the great news. I know we were all so worried. It turns out we were wrong. And sadly, that was really not the message that they wanted to hear. And she came away.
Do you admit you're wrong?
She came away from that concluding, one, that an awful lot of the culture wars, particularly in a state like Texas, are really about sowing the ground for private school vouchers. And two, that the only way to basically get the Republican Party off of this train is to set up a more moderate faction, which is exactly what they've done.
Well, indeed. I mean, you make this point over and over in your book that whenever we fight about the schools...
Not being repetitive.
No, it's not repetitive at all. It's a short book. Sorry. My point was, you make this point over and over that when we fight about the schools, we're really fighting about something else. Isn't that true? Whether it's civil rights or gender ideas or whatever it is. All right, parents' rights. You have a whole section on this at the end of the book. Both of you can weigh in on this. A lot of you are parents. What are parents' rights in the public schools? I mean, I have my own opinions, and sometimes I'm too bold about it. I say things, and then I read a book like yours, and I think, I got to get more nuanced on this. What are parents' rights when it comes to the public schools, and how should teachers approach that?
I think we should start with Johann and maybe get a little background on how...
The historian first. I like that.
Oh, okay. I was going to give this one to you. I guess one of the things to think about, right? There's two problems, and in the 19th century, this is really a problem that Catholic parents faced, which is when the schools are unwelcoming to your kids, what rights do you have to opt out of the system, to gain public funds, because education is a public good, and how are you going to do that, right? That's a parents' rights question that is animating a lot of the right today, because with the secularization of our public schools after the 1960s, a lot of families, Catholic and Protestant, in certain contexts Jewish and Muslim, and certainly black and white, felt, certainly in the 60s, there was a lot of people who felt taking God out of the schools would undermine public education. And so this is a fundamental problem because it conflates our religious liberty questions with our public education questions, and it mixes them all up. What I was also thinking about is when I think about parental rights, I think about how much they're at odds with democracy, right? And so Catholic parents had a point in the 19th century. The schools were overtly Protestant. They were discriminatory in certain ways.
Sometimes they burned Catholic schools.
Well, mobs burn Catholic schools. They would actually, And also integrated schools would be torn off their foundations, and, like the effort to protect the community from certain types of other people was very real. But also was the fact that the public schools were open to Catholics, as long as you're willing to handle the fact that you're going to read out of, they're going to get read the Protestant Bible, and they're going to be told that, America's a Protestant country. And that was a lot for Catholic parents to handle. So these struggles are not all pretend, right? The question becomes, how do we collectively in a pluralistic society create this public good? And that's where parents' rights to me seem undemocratic and absolutist, right? Because what parents' rights then become is not how do we collectively get through this complex thing we're going to fight over all the time, because we're never all going to be the same, and yet we want collective institutions where we collectively produce public goods like education. But if you say, I have an absolute veto over my fellow parents, neighbors, citizens, policymakers, what you're actually saying is that my claim on my kid is absolutist, that there is no public good, and that unless everything is perfect, I get the right of purity here. And that to me seems like a kind of more like an absolutist claim that's being made right now than a claim that we've always struggled over, which is it's hard to have collective institutions in a pluralistic society, and the particular ways in which we compromise the common versus the diverse, the rights of individuals versus the rights of the collective, the people, to socialize the next generation will always have to be rebalanced. I mean, that's just living in a democracy. And so I guess those are my kind of two thoughts.
Beautifully put. Pluralism is beautiful, but it ain't easy.
The curriculum in Texas that community was so worked up about was focused on social and emotional learning, and all the educators in the room know exactly what that was. And when the school board member looked at it, she was like, well, I don't understand. Why is everyone so worked up? This is just about teaching kids to respect one another and view one another as equals. And on the one hand, that just sounds so commonsensical. And yet, on the other hand, so much of the thread of parents' rights resistance that runs through particularly modern American history is parents who see signs of social engineering everywhere. And so if you go back to the 1950s, this was a huge thing. Parents were worried about integration. They were worried about the role of the United Nations in the schools, and that their kids were being molded to be global citizens. And they weren't sure how they felt about that. They didn't necessarily want. What if they wanted kids who were going to be little American exceptionalists? And you can go back even further. I saw a reference to a father grumbling because the kid came home and said, we shouldn't be eating white bread anymore. They told us at school brown bread is healthier. And this was in, like the early 20th centuries. And so much of that tension has to do with parents feeling like their kids are being shaped in a direction that they wouldn't choose themselves. But Johann, I think that you're absolutely right, because what we're seeing right now, especially with regards to the debates over religious freedom, is a kind of zero-sum definition of parents' rights. And so that, if you as a parent decide you're uncomfortable with the book disappears for all of the kids. Some places now are letting when we hear parents' rights, we think, well, it just is putting the decisions into the hands of individual parents, but it's certain groups of parents. And so in Virginia, for example, they passed a quite regressive policy about gender identification in the schools. And the decision about how a child, what kind of his pronouns, et cetera, it's not just up to that child's parents, it's up to the larger group of parents, whether they think that the child's parents' wishes should be respected. And I think that's why we're in a moment of such intense disagreement.
Well, and aren't we reaping, again, your book is so good on this, we are reaping so many of the profound changes that have occurred, well, since the 60s, since this and since that, the culture wars of the 1990s. This is one of them. In gender, in race, in religion, in all kinds of the most fundamental values that we have. Where does that get fought out? Public schools. Now, you didn't completely take my bait about the right-wing crusade. And who's funding it, and how big is it, and what do they really want?
Yeah, so so when I was doing my barnstorming tour through Iowa, I would just, I would have a slide with just a picture of 3 billionaires. So one was Betsy DeVos, who everybody knows. But Jeff Yass, people are less familiar with. He's the richest man in Pennsylvania. And then if any of you read the New York Times Sunday Magazine, over the weekend they had a big feature about 2 billionaire brothers in Texas, the Dunn brothers. And what do all of these individuals have in common besides the fact that they are billionaires? Their single animating passion is also school privatization. And so one of the reasons why we're seeing so much activity right now is just that we changed the rules of our politics and we handed the largest microphone to folks who have the most money and power. And so they're now in a position where they're basically going state by state. And if you have, say, rural Republicans who are opposed to private school vouchers because they think their communities will suffer, these folks are now funding political action committees that have enough money, they're able to knock out those representatives. And so it's having a profound effect on state and local politics. So I think a big part of what we're seeing right now is just the fact that they do have a lot more influence. And then, I think they see the fact that we're fighting about the schools, including sometimes for good reason, as Johann pointed out. They see that as a big opening. That if your goal is to move us back to that older vision where it's up to individual parents to pay for the cost of K through 12, much like we do with higher ed, well, then you're going to figure out ways to fan the flames.
And in fact, an elephant in the room in your book, although you get right to it, and an elephant in the room on this question is this private-public conundrum, isn't it? 85%, everybody in a school goes to a public institution. But those 15% in the private schools have enormous power in producing the next leadership class. If you work for Yale, you always are noticing an article about this lawyer and that CEO and this. They went to Yale. I mean, I get accused now. I'm on a webinar just yesterday or the day before about the new AHA report on history teaching. And one of my colleagues on the panel said, and most of those people, David, were trained at Yale, as though I'm responsible. I didn't go here. And I'm not responsible. Certainly not for Ron DeSantis. Anyway, but the public-private conundrum is huge. And we all know parents. You are perhaps some of them. If you can afford to get your kid into that dynamite private high school instead of the public school, the draw, the urge is so powerful in this culture now. So powerful because it's a ticket. I mean, I have incredible sympathy or empathy for parents who go through this now, who may have been themselves educated in public schools. They believe absolutely in this democratic ideal, but they know their kid's going to get that fabulous education from over there at the Dalton School or whatever. I won't name any local ones here for safety's sake. But could both of you say a few words on it? Because that is an elephant in the room in America. I mean, public universities, which were honestly the path to the middle class in the United States. My brother and I are educated in public universities, and they have everything to do with why we've become anything we've done. Everything. And they were dirt cheap when we got to go there. I'm now a donor to Michigan State University, where I was an undergraduate and did an MA degree, and they think I'm donor class now. Little do they know. 75% of all of the funding in that great Big Ten university is private funding. They do the same thing in development that private universities do. Everything depends on it. Everything from the new press box in the football stadium to the library. Depends on private funding. So the public university is becoming almost completely privatized anyway. So these billionaires who want to privatize the schools, they got the zeitgeist on their side. And they know it. Okay? Want to comment on that, elephant? You're the historian. How did we get here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's two pieces. I always say this. There's two pieces because I don't always want to give one answer, but part of it. But I think one is that there are a lot of stakeholders out there that conservatives are cultivating who have a stake in a private system, and some of them are the ones who go to the rich private schools, but a lot of them are going to religious schools that are not so rich and not so well off, and these are parents who have opted out for a whole host of reasons. And what you do as a political party is you develop stakeholders. So if you take voucher money and you say, we're now going to give you money to pay for this thing you had to pay for on your own, you've now developed loyalty and commitment to that group of people. And you've undermined some of the funding that supports the common institutions, the public schools. And so there's that calculation. There's the privatizers just don't believe in the state. And then there's also the investors. Like when you've got $1 trillion industry, if you can get a piece of that pie to profit, and you see that's how schools have been developed all over Africa and South America, that you can get a piece of this pie if we can find a way to channel this money through for-profit companies, you're going to push that. And I think as long as our dominant rhetoric of public schools is this is about getting your child ahead, parents are not primed to know how to fight back. They're not primed to know how to resist. They're not primed to say, wait a second, there's other goods involved that we care about. We care about our community. We care about citizenship. We care about, because I think I'm a parent, and like I go to my school sometimes and I'm like, why can't my kid take this class? And then the citizen in me says, I know exactly why, because this is a public good that my kid doesn't always have to be the beneficiary, and there are costs and benefits to being part of a public school. And so that's a real tension for every parent. But I think parents can also be primed, and they were primed in the past at times, to say, wait, these are things that are worth fighting for. And I think that's what's happening in the moments Jennifer's been covering, where parents come together to resist this. So I'm going to stop there and hand you the mic, because I think you see that parents are, when they are primed to be citizens and reminded of what they care about, they'll rise to the occasion and sometimes push back.
Voila.
So I live in Massachusetts, and if you go to an affluent community like Brookline or Newton, you'll notice that a growing number of the storefronts now are special kind of boutique tutoring little stores. And so after school, you might take your kid to the STEMnasium, or one of the specialty math.
They're called STEMnasium?
It might be called a STEMnasium. But the idea is that for this particular subset of parents, they feel like the stakes are unimaginably high. I have a grandson, adorable, and we're watching kind of amazed, trying to make sense of his parents they seem very concerned that he learn as much as possible as quickly as possible. And we haven't sat down and talked to them, but I imagine that they feel a pressure, and the feeling that if you don't get the right education, the distance that you will fall is now wider and wider. And this has come at a huge cost in our country, not not just for those parents and for those kids who often end up being really unhappy, right? Because they're under such intense pressure to strive and achieve and succeed. But because we've ended up in with a way of talking about schools that if you don't succeed and you don't go to a good one, well, then you're kind of a loser, and your failure to succeed economically is kind of your own fault. And if you have any doubt about the cost of that way of thinking, I would just have you look around the country into the election we're living through right now. So I think you're right to absolutely, that it is absolutely the case that there is exciting organizing happening, but I really feel like the bigger problem is that defining education as an individual good with really, really high stakes is just, that's the water we swim in and the air that we breathe. And until we get away from that, the privatizing the schools is really just easy pickings.
Well, everybody here knows it's a major industry to prep kids, to tutor kids for getting in. Stemnasium. God, what a term that is. You use a term in the book, don't remember, whether you were drawing it from anybody or not, but to save our public schools, to win this school wars, it's almost like, or did you say it? No, I think you said it. You said it's like we have to relearn democracy. I found that interesting and useful. It's like, come on, public schools, it's a way to go relearn democracy. You really believe in democracy? Okay, you're the parent, Johann. You go to the school, and you got ideas about what ought to be taught in that class. You do this. You're a professor. But maybe I got to back off here. Now I'm a parent. Now I'm not because that's the spirit of, that's how Whitman defined democracy. I will have only what all my other fellow citizens have as well. But that's not easy. Not in America that teaches us individualism by drinking the water, And what's the highest value of all? I want the best for my kids, or your kids, or anyway. Okay, we're going to end on a hopeful note here, I think. Is that okay? Good, because I'm not sure how to. Maybe you two do, but anyway. The schools are in crisis. And I'll just say this real quick and then just hand it off for a final comment, and then we'll take some questions. There's a brand new study out. You can get it already, at least on the AHA website. There's been good press coverage already, New York Times, et cetera. There's going to be much more coverage. It's called American Lesson Plan. Have you seen this yet? Oh, you have. Okay, good. And you have too. Okay. It's a major 2-year study done by the American Historical Association. They got a huge grant to do this. They got $2 million. They hired a survey company in Chicago, et cetera. They went to 9 states. And there's a whole theory about how they chose their states. They developed a gigantic database of interviews with, I forget how many thousands of teachers, administrators, and curriculum experts, which is a major profession now. When I was a high school teacher and they told us we had to go spend a day with a curriculum expert, we all figured out some way to be sick. We didn't want to talk to. Still happens? Of course. No, I know it does. I mean, a curriculum expert? That was like, it's like eating your broccoli or worse. I mean, God, we wanted to run our own curriculum, and we did. Ugh. And they were paid more than we were. Anyway, enough of that. But this new study is amazing, folks, because it asks a lot of questions, but the central question was, what's actually being taught in American classroom? Here we're having all these school wars and all these school board wars and all this fighting over wokeism and critical race theory, on and on and on. But what's actually being taught? And it's a wide and deep data study. And what it shows is that even though every state now has standards, and more standards, teachers are creative. Teachers are clever. At least the ones who survive. They're finding their ways around standards, even though they have to obey them to some extent. They're finding their ways even a little bit around testing. And when teachers are really asked what they most want, they want time to read. They want content. They want to learn more. And they want to be respected. And they wouldn't mind a pay raise. And so all this rhetoric, this imagery, symbolism of the teachers aren't any good anymore, or even the ones that are good are worn out and tired, and they're not going to stay with it anyway, and all that. Well, of course that's true to some extent, and they are beleaguered. There are veteran teachers who get interviewed in this study who say, yeah, I've been teaching 28 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this, what we're going through now. But I'm still teaching what I know how to teach. So I read, and I was asked to be a reader for this, outside reader. I came away from it so hopeful. Well, I guess it sort of confirmed my prejudices. I want to believe the teachers who want to run their own curriculum and want to go read and learn more. But by God, they do. So whether we win this schools war, or whether we just fight it out in this stage, you seem hopeful in the end. Why?
I'm a sunny, hopeful person by nature. But I have to say, so my trip to Iowa, I was in 6 communities, 4 urban, 2 rural, and
the Midwest.
It was the
Hope, go to the Midwest.
And Iowa is a place that has made a really sharp turn over the past 5 or 6 years, and a lot of people there are really shocked. It was a state that has always prided itself on the quality of its public schools and its public institutions more broadly, libraries, higher ed, and now it's suddenly moving in a very different direction, and inequality seems to be the goal. And so we traveled all over, but it was it was in the rural areas where people, like surprising numbers of people, came out. And they were trying to figure out what was going on, but most importantly, what could they do about it? And the energy in the room, was electric, and you could see that they were just enjoying being in a room with neighbors and with people who cared about the future of the little local public school. And there were, sometimes we would talk about politics too, but there were definitely, it was not just NPR tote bag carriers, right? Like there were, this concern over the future of public education has the potential to bring together a diverse coalition across multiple kinds of lines of difference, and that's what really gives me hope and heart.
That sounds like democracy. My God.
Well, this report, one of the things that comes out of it is there were times in the last few years, particularly in kind of left media places, where there was this idea that teachers are whitewashing the past, and this was coming from a radically progressive perspective. And all teachers there were even people who were talking about shutting down history classes until we can reform the entire curriculum. And then the right was saying teachers are not whitewashing the past, they're teaching critical race theory all the time. And we need to get kids out of those classrooms. And what you realize coming out of the study is, in a profession this big, teachers are diverse, and they're not always bringing their politics into the classroom. And even when they are, the majority are kind of left of center, and there's some that are moderate, but the majority is kind of hovering around the middle, as is often the case. And they're careful, and they try to avoid partisan curricula, and they're trying to be generous and earn the trust of people. And the media portrays, and so I think one of the things that comes out of this is that when the media portrays all teachers as either left-wing or right-wing, and we sort of conflate that image with the diversity of actual people, it gets lost. And that brings me to Jennifer's point, which is, I think actually, some people say in a democracy you don't have to like your fellow citizens, and I actually don't buy that. I think you kind of do. And I think most Americans do like their neighbors, and they have this sense that they can overcome, when they're in a room together and realizing what they share in common, they're willing to argue over their differences in a different way than when they're fighting with stereotypes. And so that's what gives me hopes, is that people really do care about their public schools. And they actually maybe at some point are going to be tired of yelling at each other, because we're complex people. And we went through a moment where, for a host of reasons that historians and sociologists and whatnot will fight over for a long time, there was a lot of passion unleashed. But we can't, I think I get a sense sometimes when I'm out there that people don't want to hate each other all the time. And that too passes, because we recognize that we care about things and we care about each other. And that's what gives me hope.
Wouldn't you like your child to have him as a teacher and her as a teacher? We have a microphone up here that can be passed around. Let's take a few questions. We can go at least till 7. Who wants to go first? Yes, up in the front row. Now, use the mic, because we're recording this whole thing, by the way. If you don't want to be recorded, it's too late. It's about 8 minutes to 7.
I guess I was just going to ask if you all could talk a little bit about the historic contributions of communities of color, who I think in a lot of ways have faced undue burden in sort of doing for the public good and for public systems, when they are the ones that have been least served by them oftentimes. And I'm thinking about both sort of the historical context of when you're thinking about a community sort of agreeing to certain kinds of loss for the collective good. I think about the story of integration and what was lost. For example, huge numbers of black teachers, and the more recent examples of things like the actual hunger strikes in Chicago around Diet High School. What people have historically been asked to put on the line, and how to reconcile this call for all members of a democratic populace to contribute to the public good, when we are also at a huge deficit in terms of who has been expected to contribute what and has actually contributed so much, kind of to lead us up to where we are now.
Thank you, and I'll pass this on. But of course, this idea of the public school got a huge boost for a while during Reconstruction, and this incredible creation on a scale of schools for black people in the South, black children and black adults. The very idea of the public school got re-energized by Reconstruction. But Johann, you write about this, so you know more about it than I do.
Well, I think part of, in the 19th century, one way to answer this is that in many places, put aside the South, and because obviously with slavery, black Americans were not only denied access to public education, but after rebellions and whatnot, they were denied access by law to literacy. But in the North, it's more complicated. You have places where you have integrated schools, but what you have, I think, in the black community in the pre-Civil War North, and in the pre-Civil War South, but it can't be openly said, is a real recognition both of the denial, but also of the value of these public goods. And so black Americans have often been among the leaders who mobilized for these public goods. Because of the very deficit, they're actually more aware of how important access to these goods are. And so they in some ways then mobilize in ways that enrich our entire democracy, because they push for public goods that benefit all Americans in the end. And that is a real burden. And it's been a struggle, and it remains a struggle, because actually over the last 20, 30 years, we're actually more segregated by race than we were before. That the push away from the idea of integration, which certainly came from suburban Southern white people who fled, but it also came from urban urban areas that were black and said, integration is a dream that we care less about than success in school. And so we lost faith in that particular aspect because the historical experience of many black Americans was we're having to suffer the burdens to integrate America's schools. And so I think you're right that this is something we have to really think about and recognize both the ways in which black mobilization has expanded the ideals of American democracy that have benefited all Americans, but also recognize that if those public goods are goods, how do we move forward in a way that at the same time just practically politically doesn't create the backlash, but still retains a commitment to some of these things like integrated schools are vital in a pluralistic society. We need to get back to them.
You have a whole section on black parents' rights in your book. I mean, you might pick up.
Just think how often you've heard the expression that school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. And, there's a lot of truth to that, right? That the push for alternatives outside of public school systems is absolutely real. And the desire for schools that meet the needs of parents and communities. And I think we're at such a weird moment because a lot of the political power and money that was helping to seed that movement has now decided that there's more to be gained from turning sharply against civil rights and, in fact, trying to roll civil rights back. And so I think we're a lot of this now is sort of we need to figure out how we're all going to work together, because a lot of the folks I know have spent the last 10, 15 years devoting all their time to trying to stop charter schools. And now it turns out that we actually have a much bigger cause that has the potential to bring us together.
Another question? Sure. Just go up and grab the mic. Go ahead.
I'm interested in your take on online K-12 education, and I want to frame that. I've been involved in distance education research for 48 years.
Can you all hear this?
Pardon me?
Everybody can hear this? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and I feel that the mediums of online has been unfairly indicted because, in large part, teachers are not trained or indoctrinated into using the modality of teaching online efficaciously. What's your take on that? Khan Academy, et cetera.
Online teaching. Khan Academy. I don't know much about Khan Academy, except I went to speak to the Florida Teachers Association recently in Sarasota, and the Khan Academy was one of the organizations that had a booth there showing their videos and everything. So I got a little bit educated about that, but you know more about that.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about online learning is that if you measure it just, sort of by the effectiveness by test scores, it does. A lot of these schools do really, really badly. But the other thing we know is that there are a lot of parents who really like it. So we need to understand more about that. I would say where I get really worried is where you see all the worst trends converging in a single vision, the for-profit micro school. And that's the vision there is that, there's no teacher, there's a guide. The guide is paid sort of like an Uber or Lyft driver per, number of head of, the kids in the room. The kids learn online. The guide doesn't have to have any education training or background at all. They just have to pass a background check. But, if your goal is to spend as little as possible on education, this is a vision that speaks to you. And I think what worries me about a lot of the online stuff is that the people who are most excited about it are the people who think that we spend way too much money on education in this country, or they'd like a nice cut off the top.
Okay. One more. Anybody? Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, try to get to the mic because we're recording the whole thing. So, oh, and you're a teacher here.
I'm not a teacher here. I teach up in Middletown.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
But I am a proud graduate of New Haven Public Schools, Metropolitan. Ms. Plateau was my AP government teacher and my peer leadership teacher. And I am also a graduate of twice over from Southern Connecticut. Got my BA in 2020, MA in 2023. But I grew up in New Haven, and I'm fully publicly educated in New Haven, but I moved here to the United States when I was about 3 years old with my parents from Uruguay. And I was thinking about what you guys were saying about how in public schools in the United States, we really learn how to be an American. And I think about, so my dad didn't graduate from high school, but he is very well read and values education a lot. And he, let me try and, I'm sorry, I'm an English teacher, so I tend to ramble.
It's always a danger to start talking about your dad. It gets you
Yeah,
off.
I'm gonna move a little bit away from my dad. I think about I think about the assault on public education, and in particular with university. I'm a DACA recipient, so I could not file for the FAFSA. But I was a beneficiary of the New Haven Promise, which is a scholarship that Yale funds through New Haven Public Schools, where if you meet certain requirements, you are given a free ride to any public school in Connecticut. And I was able to attend Southern as a result of that. And it's there where I learned, a lot of the sort of benchmarks for, democratic thinking in the United States. So Whitman, Emerson, Baldwin, Du Bois, and I think about if I hadn't had an access to that education, where would I be right now? And I was able to get an access to that education because of the public schools here in New Haven, and because of the fact that Southern is a public university and was accessible for me to attend. And I think about other new Americans who may not have access to that in the near future if this assault on public education continues. And I just want to think about what you guys' take is on that, in terms of not just a public education for the people who were born here, but for new Americans, for immigrants who come to this country seeking out this ideal of an American education, and the horrible effects that might take effect if they're not given access to that.
Thank you. Wow. You're from Central Casting, man. Jennifer leaned over to me and said, "Did you plant him here?" No. But thank you, good brother. You're the embodiment of this whole point. You also, I think, have a little bit of Johann's immigrants' passion for this thing called an American experiment, which you apparently discovered through public schools. That's a real thing. I mean, you and I have talked about that before, but so thank you. I'm surprised you didn't get a standing ovation, but anyway. Okay, well, we've kind of run out of time here, and it's the dinner hour. But please join me in thanking Jennifer and Johann. You both have, we didn't practice this or rehearse this. It's just worked because both of you know so much about this, spend your lives on this, and care about it. There are still subjects, believe it or not, in Jennifer's book we didn't actually touch upon. So it's time to buy both books, folks, from Possible Futures right over here. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and please thank Jennifer and Johann with me.